people such as myself who believe that the Book of Mormon is a translation of an ancient text and it contains historicity. I believe historicists, we can account for both the modern elements in the text, e.g., for example, King James citations, as well as the ancient convergences. However, modernists, such as Dan Vogel and others who deny or doubt the historicity, they cannot account for ancient convergences in a purely modern text.
Mormonism with the Murph, where we do a fair and objective analysis of the church and its truth claims, its history, doctrine, and policy. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Latter-day Saint explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. And I'm really excited for today's episode. I have with me, I'm going to be interviewing Stephen Smoot. Stephen, thanks for coming on.
Well, other Stephen, thank you for having me on your show. From one Stephen to another.
You can call me the Murph to avoid confusion.
Sounds good.
It's weird saying Stephen on this.
Yes.
You can call me the Murph. But
Stephen Smoot, props the fact that you spell your name the right Stephen and not that fake Stephen with a V. So
yes, you spell it the right way as well with a P.
Yes, indeed.
That's the biblical way.
The biblical way, absolutely. Well grounded in antiquity, none of this weird Germanic English crap with a V. So good for you.
Don't be telling that to Stephen Harper. He'll be
offended. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, my colleague and friend Stephen Harper. Yes, with all due respect.
So just an introduction to any of my listeners who don't know who you are. So Stephen Smoot, he has a master's in Semitic and Egyptian literature and languages, also a master's in Near and Middle Eastern civilizations. I could barely read my handwriting. Also a PhD in Semitic and Egyptian languages and literature. Also, you've done work with FAIR and also Book of Mormon Central, and you teach as well at BYU. And Stephen's also done a lot of work sort of like in articles, scholarship, a lot on, the Book of Mormon, Book of Abraham as well, and just biblical scholarship and apologetics in general. Is that about right?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I did my undergraduate degree at BYU in Near Eastern Studies. My emphasis there was in the Hebrew Bible, so Old Testament Hebrew and Aramaic. I went on to get my master's from the University of Toronto, as you said, with an emphasis in Egyptology at the University of Toronto in Near Middle Eastern civilizations. And I'm now halfway through my doctorate program at the Catholic University of America in Semitic and Egyptian languages. I've acquired a second master's through that process, and I'm about 2 years off from finishing. I just have to write up my dissertation. I'm getting to that stage of writing up my dissertation for the doctorate. And in the meantime, I'm an adjunct instructor of religious education at BYU in the Department of Religious Education. And I moonlight for the B.H. Roberts Foundation, which is an independent nonprofit research organization. And as you mentioned in the past, I've also worked at Book of Mormon Central, and I've done volunteer work with the Interpreter Foundation and with, back then it was FAIR. I guess it's FAIR LDS or FAIR Mormon now, I think is the new name.
Yeah, I think FAIR Latter-day Saints. Yeah.
Or FAIR Latter-day Saints, that's right. Yeah. So I've kind of been plugged in with that ecosystem now for quite a while, sort of going in tangent with my academic career as it's been growing.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's amazing whenever you sent me your CV, just how much, education and scholarship and apologetics that you've been involved in. You're somebody who, I've watched you on, different platforms and read some of your articles. So it's fun and exciting to have you here and to have a conversation and an interview.
Well, like I said, thank you for the opportunity. I've seen some of your interviews you've done recently. I know we have our mutual friend, Robert Boylan. He kind of queued me up on. Robert says hello, by the way, and he wishes you all the best up there in what he calls, quote, occupied territory, end quote, of Northern Ireland, as I understand. So I don't know the intricacies of Irish. I don't know the intricacies of Irish politics, so I will assiduously avoid discussing any of that. But so Robert sends his regards. And I've seen some of your very interesting interviews recently with Stephen Harper and Brian Hales, another friend of mine that I've watched. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to come on your show. Thank you.
Yeah, and Robert's a good guy. I miss him. We've not really been able to collaborate since he's gone to the other side of the pond.
He's now in Utah. Well, he's my coworker now, my colleague at the Roberts Foundation. So I get to see Robert pretty much every day in the office. He's a great guy.
Yeah. Hi to you, Robert. Miss you. So I'm, doing a series on the Book of Mormon, and the Book of Mormon, it's, considered to be, according to Joseph Smith, the keystone of our religion. It is sort of like the convincing evidence of Joe Smith as a prophet, and the church being what it claims to be, and really the church sort of, it rises or falls with the authenticity of the Book of Mormon. So this interview is all going to be about the authenticity and historicity of the Book of Mormon. So we're not sure if we're going to do just one long episode, or we might split it in two parts, depending on how this goes. But part one is really going to be talking about sort of like an evidence-based case for the Book of Mormon. So we'll be talking about the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, the translation process, the witnesses of the gold plates and of the Book of Mormon translation. Stephen will be sharing what he views as sort of like both textual and archaeological evidence to support the Book of Mormon. And then we'll be sort of putting him on defense and responding to maybe some of the criticisms or arguments by critics towards the Book of Mormon, looking at things like anachronisms or the King James Bible, or 19th century elements. Is Joseph just pulling from other books in his area, and also things to do with maybe biblical scholarship like Deutero, Isaiah. We're not going to be able to cover every single thing with the Book of Mormon, but I think this will be hopefully a good interview and a good discussion, and we're going to try to cover as much as we can within the couple of hours we're going to have together.
I don't know, Murph. I feel like we can once and for all definitively settle the debates around Book of Mormon historicity in about 2 hours. That doesn't seem too ambitious to me. Yeah.
That'll be debate done. Never have to talk about it again.
Yes, indeed.
And apologies to any of my listeners if I sound a bit nasally. I have had COVID the last few days. I am feeling a bit better, but my voice probably doesn't sound super good. But adrenaline's going to get me through this, because I am excited, especially for somebody who's done so much work and your expertise on this. And this will be great for me to ask some of the questions that I have, and questions that listeners might have as well, and to hear some of the case for the Book of Mormon as well. Is there anything...
No pressure on me then, I guess, right? No, I think this is great. No pressure on me to single-handedly prove and defend the Book of Mormon. No, just sort of kidding there. Yeah, no, again, thank you for the opportunity. This is a subject I find tremendously interesting. As you can see from my body of work, I have some opinions on this matter, we could say, right? And I've shared them over time, and so I'm always happy to talk about them. I think it's a worthwhile discussion to have. I welcome the discussion and conversation. I think that the Book of Mormon stands on its own. I think it can weather the questions and even the attacks. And I think, if I'm allowed to use this metaphor, it ages like fine wine. I know that's not a word of wisdom approved metaphor, but that's how the Book of Mormon ages, in my view, as we look at it closely and as we scrutinize it. So I'm happy to have the conversation.
That's awesome. And Stephen, he's prepared, some slides for today, and so he'll be, as he's going through the presentation, I'll maybe interject with thoughts, comments, questions, any pushback if that ever comes up, and hopefully this will be a fun and entertaining discussion.
By all means. So let me see if I host has disabled screen sharing, so I guess you've got to share on your end. I'll let you figure out how to do that.
Let me see. Let me just pause 1 second. Okay. You can now share the screen.
Okay, perfect. Sorry for those momentary technical difficulties. Let me see. Microsoft PowerPoint. I think this is what I want to share.
Yes, that's the one.
Okay. All right. You can see my PowerPoint slides?
Yes.
All right. Let me go into viewer mode. So hopefully you can see like the presentation mode. You're not seeing the back end with like the slides and the technical stuff, right?
No, full presentation mode.
Okay, great. Tremendous. Well, yes, I'll try to run through this as expeditiously as possible. We'll try not to get too lost in the weeds here. But I thought to help sort of guide along our conversation, I just threw together some slides. And I want to apologize in advance to your listeners, Murph, because a lot of what I'm going to do is kind of like just an extended book report, or as we like to say in our fancy PhD programs, a literature review, right? But it's basically just a book report. So I'm going to be going through sort of looking at a lot of the scholarship that's been done, try to focus on what's been done recently, but kind of give a broad overview of the case that has been made, because I am a very unoriginal person. A lot of what I am pulling from here has been in print for a long time. I thought it might be good to just kind of go through and shoot some of the highlights for your viewers.
Yeah, and those would be great things to point out to people to go check out, to dive a little bit deeper here. Some sources or some places to read up on things more in depth.
Yeah, exactly. So hopefully these are sources I recommend to your listeners, and they can pursue them at their leisure as they wish. So let's start with the coming forth in translation of the Book of Mormon. I figure this is a good place to start, right? So how did we actually get this book, the Book of Mormon? How did it come to us? And I'll run through sort of a broad summary of what my thinking is on this, and then I'll provide some examples. So in summary,
Yeah.
the details of the coming forth and the translation and the publication of the Book of Mormon, so its publication history, its compositional history, they are very well documented. In fact, I know Stephen Harper has said this about the First Vision. He's called the First Vision one of the best documented theophanies of religious history. I
Yes.
would be willing to say that the Book of Mormon is one of the best documented origins of a sacred text of any religious tradition. The amount of data that we have on the composition and coming forth of the Book of Mormon is fantastic. I know biblical scholars that would kill to have this kind of data for the composition of the biblical books, for example, right? And
Yeah.
so we have a lot of data and evidence to work with, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing because, in my opinion, it paints a very good positive picture for the authenticity of the Book of Mormon, but it's also kind of problematic because there's a lot of stuff to handle, right? There's a lot of material to sort of try to wrap your hands around, but we'll do our best. In my judgment, as I have looked at the documentary record, as I look at the evidence for the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, and we're talking about the manuscript evidence that survives from the original and printer's manuscript of the Book of Mormon, and we're talking about the primary eyewitness accounts from those who were involved with the production of this book. And we're not just talking about Joseph Smith, we're also talking about Oliver Cowdery, Martin Harris, Emma Smith, David Whitmer, a whole bunch of people.
Yeah.
In my judgment, the documentary record strongly supports Joseph Smith's account of the origins of the Book of Mormon. I am confirmed that when you look at the body of evidence, the evidence supports the authenticity of Joseph Smith's account. And more than just that, however, I'm also convinced that skeptical, or you might say naturalistic accounts of the Book of Mormon, and by that I mean accounts of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon or Book of Mormon origins that deny the existence of the quote unquote supernatural or anything divine, skeptical or naturalistic accounts not only have to ignore or downplay the documentary record, but in many instances, they actually outright misrepresent what the historical data says. This is a trend I have noticed over many years of reading both historical and polemical literature on the origins of the Book of Mormon. And you don't have to take my word for it, because there's a fellow named Richard Bushman who noticed the same thing. I'm sure your listeners all know who Richard Bushman is. He is Joseph Smith's preeminent biographer. And he said this all the way back in 1997. So this is even before he wrote Rough Stone Rolling. Quote, Mormon writers are more inclined to put the reports from people close to Joseph Smith in the story. Because the recovery of the Book of Mormon is a sacred story, every detail is relished. Most of the detailed sources were written by believers, and that includes, I'll interject here, Joseph Smith's family, Joseph Smith's early supporters, those who were directly involved in the production of the Book of Mormon. They were written by believers, and to follow them too closely infuses a narrative with their faith. And to interject again, that's a problem, of course, because we're supposed to be living in a disenchanted world where the supernatural or the divine supposedly doesn't exist. And so Bushman says, quote, secular historians are therefore more inclined than Mormons to suppress source material from Joseph's closest associates. That's a problem. Right. If you are going to deliberately ignore or misrepresent what the documentary sources say, just because they are coming from Joseph Smith's closest associates or his family, and just because they believe in the divinity of what they're doing, that is still problematic to suppress this or to ignore it or to sweep it aside. We'll maybe show some examples with the Book of Mormon witnesses, but this sort of thing would be totally unacceptable in any other historical endeavor. No responsible historian would say, well, I'm just going to ignore this really important firsthand primary source material just because it's coming from believers. But this is very commonly what we encounter happening with skeptical or naturalistic origins of the Book of Mormon. They have to deliberately deprioritize or de-emphasize the better historical data relative to the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. And Richard Bushman and myself and others find that problematic, to say the least.
Right. No, that totally makes sense. Because it's them almost, dismissing or saying that those their accounts or their eyewitness testimonies are not credible or not reliable, and they need to be taken into account. You can't just dismiss them, particularly if they are primary accounts, eyewitnesses of what was taking place.
That's exactly right. we can't dismiss them just because they may paint an uncomfortable picture for our ideological or worldview commitments. And this is what I see happening. Now, to be fair, Latter-day Saints have done the same thing too in the past at times, right? You get this on both sides, but in my judgment, it's much more pronounced and much more egregious when it comes to the origins and the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. But we won't belabor that point. This is just to sort of make this point at the outset. So when I talk about the data that we have for the coming forth of the Book of Mormon and for Joseph Smith's documentary record that he leaves behind, let me just run through some examples. So I hope you and your readers know who Dean Jesse is. Dean Jesse is one of the forefathers, one of the pioneering scholars of doing documentary history on Joseph Smith. So he's kind of the grandfather of what is today now the Joseph Smith papers. He published the series back, I want to say in the early 80s, the papers of Joseph Smith, or at least he began this effort in the early 80s, the papers of Joseph Smith. He produced 2 volumes, and this kind of set the groundwork for what we have today with the Joseph Smith papers. Dean Jesse also edited the personal writings of Joseph Smith. This was also an undertaking he did. The first edition came out again in the 1980s, and then it was revised with a second edition. I recommend the second revised edition because the first edition done in the 80s unfortunately contained Mark Hoffman forgeries. That's not Dean Jesse's fault necessarily, right? Mark Hoffman had snookered everybody at that time, but the first edition does contain known forgeries, and so the second edition excised those. So this is the edition I revised. But this is to say that this effort to document and collect Joseph Smith's papers and the primary source data has been going on for a while. This all, of course, has led to the Joseph Smith Papers Project, which is about to wrap up. I think they have just about 2 or 3 more volumes left to release. This has been a monumental undertaking. This is top shelf stuff when it comes to documentary history. It's widely recognized by both LDS and non-LDS scholars as being high watermark work for documentary editing and documentary history work. So if your listeners are wondering where to find the best primary source data relative to the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, this is the place to find it. Go to the Joseph Smith papers, go to Dean Jesse's work earlier if you'd like, and I'll show some others here coming up real quick. That's all of the work relating to sort of, again, the documentary history. So collecting Joseph Smith's papers. Now, what about the Book of Mormon manuscript? I mentioned that we have the manuscript evidence. Well, this fellow here, his name is Royal Skousen.
Yeah.
Royal Skousen, you know him, you recognize him. He has been working on the critical text of the Book of Mormon for basically as long as I've been alive. I'm 32 now. He's been working on this since the late 80s. And so this is another monumental achievement, just like the Joseph Smith papers. So we have about roughly 30% of the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon is extant, and like 99.9% of the printer's manuscript is extant. And we have the various editions that were done under Joseph Smith's supervision. So I think there's at least like 3 or 4 editions. I want to say 3 editions that Joseph Smith prepared for publication. And then we have subsequent editions of the Book of Mormon. So Royal Skousen has spent his career doing the critical text project. And for your readers or your listeners that don't know, a critical text is, he's not criticizing the text as in he's passing negative judgment on it. What Royal Skousen is doing is he is carefully analyzing and critically examining the manuscript and publication history of the Book of Mormon, right? This is what we mean when we talk about a critical text. And so the Book of Mormon manuscripts have been published with critical notations and things like that. There's even a facsimile edition that have been published of the manuscripts. But also Skousen has produced analysis of the critical text of the Book of Mormon. So he has analysis of textual variants of the Book of Mormon. He has the nature of the original language of the Book of Mormon. You name it, right? So doing linguistic and manuscript work on the Book of Mormon itself. This has been Royal Skousen's undertaking. And this is, I think, next to the Joseph Smith papers, one of the most important modern academic undertakings to help us understand the origins and history of the Book of Mormon.
Stephen, is there somewhere where listeners could actually find and read the original manuscript, the 30% we have of it?
Yeah, it's all in the Joseph Smith papers. Yeah, the Joseph Smith papers has it. So the Joseph Smith papers has published both the printer's manuscript and the original manuscript, and so including they have nice big high resolution images. And so check out the Joseph Smith papers website, and you can eat your heart out with the Book of Mormon manuscripts. Awesome. And Skousen has also published early a typographical facsimile of the printers and original manuscript back in the late 90s or early 2000s. That's fine as part of the series that Skousen has done, but if you want nice high resolution images of the original, I recommend the Joseph Smith papers.
Okay, awesome.
So you've got Skousen,
yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Maybe, share in the description or something. So you've got Skousen that goes along with what the Joseph Smith papers are doing. And together, this has all led to, in the last, give or take 10 years-ish, a sort of little cottage industry of spin-off works done by primarily Latter-day Saint authors who have taken this body of data and who have looked at it and have presented it in an accessible manner for both Latter-day Saints and others. And some of the highlights, in my judgment, that I find very well good and grounded are books like From Darkness Unto Light, Joseph Smith's translation and publication of the Book of Mormon by Garrett Dirkmaat and Michael McKay, Joseph Smith's Seer Stones in the middle by Michael McKay and Nick Frederick, and then The Coming Forth of the Book of Mormon. This was the Sperry Symposium that was done in, I want to say 2016, I believe it was. There's a lot of really great material in here. So there's a spin-off industry of spin-off works related to the Coming Forth of the Book of Mormon that have grounded themselves very commendably in the data we have through the Joseph Smith papers and from Royal Skousen's work, which gives us a very good, nice picture of what the Coming Forth of the Book of Mormon is like, how it was translated, how it was published, all that sort of stuff. So if your listeners don't want to slog through all the primary data, although I don't know why they wouldn't, because it's good, clean fun to slog through the Joseph Smith papers. But if they don't want to do that, they can find these accessible monographs that help kind of navigate what this body of data shows us.
Okay.
Now, Now I should have put this earlier in the slides. I'm sorry I didn't. But this was released just, I want to say, 2 or 3 years ago by Larry Morris, who has worked at the Church History Department, among other places. A documentary history of the Book of Mormon. This was published through Oxford University Press. And as its name will tell you, this is a documentary history, meaning Morris has collected and presented the primary source data relative to the history, specifically the coming forth and the publication and translation of the Book of Mormon. And so, again, if you don't want to slog through all of the Joseph Smith papers necessarily, you can check out Larry Morris's book. What's nice about Morris's book as well is he gathers not just the data pertaining to Joseph Smith, so not just Joseph Smith's documentary record, but also sources like Oliver Cowdery, the Whitmers, Martin Harris, Emma Smith. So we have primary accounts, secondhand accounts. I think even he throws in some third-hand accounts in there from people who are related to the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. So I really strongly recommend Morris as your sort of one-stop shop for the data pertaining to the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. And you'll see what I mean. You'll see what I and Richard Bushman mean when we say that the people closest to the production of this book, they were far and away believers in this thing, right? You do have some unbelievers in here, people like Lucy Harris and Isaac Stoll. Sorry, not Isaac Stoll, Isaac Hale, Josiah Stoll. I meant to say, Isaac Hale, Emma's father, right? Joseph Smith's father-in-law. So he's in there. So you have Lucy Harris in there, right? So, but it's predominantly believers, is sort of my point here. So to my point in Bushman's, check this out and you can see what I mean when I say that the primary source data is coming from believers and it's overwhelmingly positive in my judgment for the Book of Mormon. So I don't know, anything else we want to touch on there? There's my little, for now, my little rundown of some of the do
you have a slide on the translation process of the Book of Mormon, or do you want to talk about that briefly? The Urim and Thummim and the seer stone in the translation?
Yeah, that's coming up. That's coming up in a little bit. So I'll get there in just a second. So I'll give you sort of my distillation here of when it comes to the composition of the Book of Mormon, the translation of the Book of Mormon, we'll get to in a second. Yeah. Here's what our evidence confirms. Here's what is pretty unanimously agreed on, even by non-Latter-day Saint or even skeptical authors. The evidence confirms the following. First of all, the Book of Mormon original manuscript is a dictated text with signs of a rapid pace. In other words, what we see from the original manuscript is that Joseph Smith is dictating the text and he's dictating it quickly. And we know that, for example, because as Royal Skousen shows us, Oliver Cowdery, as Joseph Smith's scribe, he is making the kinds of mistakes that you make when you mishear somebody speaking rapidly, right? And
Right.
so he is making the kinds of mistakes that we would expect from a dictated text that has been dictated rapidly. So that's very clear from the original manuscript. Joseph Smith did not make substantive revisions to the original manuscript, what text critics call O, or to the printer's manuscript, what text critics call P, right? So we can look at the manuscripts. You're not seeing major substantive revisions. You're not seeing big chunks that are X'd out and reworked, right? He's not going back and he's not reworking this. It's through one sort of shot. He's going through and he's dictating this, and then Oliver Cowdery is copying it. And there's no evidence of him going back and reworking it or making substantive revisions.
Right.
The translation period of the plates of Mormon and the small plates of Nephi. So we're talking Mosiah, like Mosiah chapter 3, basically through Words of Mormon. Remember, we go from Mosiah to the end of Moroni, and then in around June of 1829 is when Joseph Smith finishes the small plates, which is First Nephi through Words of Mormon. So that whole process happens from circa April 7th, when Oliver Cowdery begins writing for Joseph Smith. He meets him 2 days earlier, and then they start writing 2 days later. And it is done by at least the end of June, because we have a copyright for the book filed at the end of June, right? So we can date when it begins and we can date when it ends. So we're talking about roughly 75 working days, right?
Yes.
Give or take. That's pretty unanimously agreed on for this portion of the translation. This is our Book of Mormon. When we talk about our Book of Mormon that you have in your hands right now, this is what we're talking about. We're not talking about the material that was translated between late 1827 to early to mid 1828, the stuff that was lost by Martin Harris, right? So this is agreed upon by all parties, basically, that it was done in this very short period of time. This is a little more controversial. There are some people that will dispute this, but I think the evidence is fairly unambiguous that Joseph Smith did not utilize notes or any other text or manuscript in the translation. We have no evidence of him whipping out notes or pulling out a copy of Solomon Spaulding or Ethan Smith or what have you. He's not cribbing from some other source, at least in the sense that you have to say he doesn't have it open in front of him when he's dictating the text, right? And I would even go so far as to say that this includes a Bible. I believe very strongly that the evidence indicates from the eyewitnesses involved in the translation that Joseph Smith was not visually copying or reading from a Bible during the translation of the Book of Mormon. I know that that's a very popular theory. Guys like B.H. Roberts articulated this, and obviously skeptics of the authenticity of the Book of Mormon say that there is a Bible involved. If there was a Bible involved, however, Joseph Smith is not pulling it out and reading it in front of his scribes because they are very clear that he was not doing that. He did not have a text or manuscript he's working from. Instead, and we'll get here in just a second, he is dictating words that appear to him in his seer stone and or what is later called the Urim and Thummim. We can just say seer stones if we want to, because they basically are both the same thing. He is dictating words that appear to him. That comes from the people involved in the translation. That actually seems to be referred to in the Book of Mormon itself. I think it's Stanford Carmack has an article on that. And I believe this also includes the biblical citations. And Royal Skousen's work on the King James citations in the Book of Mormon seems to back this up. Royal Skousen says, based on the manuscript evidence we have, it seems that the biblical citations in the Book of Mormon were dictated. They were not visually copied from an open Bible. So that's why I say, yes, there are clearly biblical citations, but those citations, I believe, are being read by Joseph Smith as they appear to him in the seer stone. So this is our breakdown. And by the way, here's just a couple more examples of the literature that you can look at, that your readers can look at, or sorry, listeners can look at. I keep saying readers. I'm sorry. I'm used to writing to people and not podcasting to people. So apologies. Your listeners can check out these articles. So John W. Welch, we can almost do a day-by-day breakdown of the translation. That's how good the documentary record is. It's almost that good. I mean, there are still some gaps, right? But we have a pretty tight confirmation on the translation timeline, and John W. Welch has published on it. Michael McKay and Garrett Dirkmaat, again, they have collated and discussed the firsthand eyewitness accounts of the translation process. And then we have Royal Skousen's work, translating the Book of Mormon, evidence from the original manuscript. Based on the textual details of the manuscript, what can we say about the nature of the translation? So this is just to give you a sampling of the literature that's out there, to show what I mean when I say that this is pretty widely agreed upon, these points here in this last slide, even if obviously there is some disagreement perhaps with the last 2 points, because the question is, where are the biblical citations coming from? But for my money, I think this is what we have going on here. So I don't know, anything else before we proceed into Urim and Thummim or all that sort of stuff?
Well, I'm sure we're going to talk about later, the tight versus loose translation, because there's sort of debate. There's, some faithful scholars or apologists who would believe with the long passages being quoted in the Bible or being borrowed or plagiarized, they must have consulted and opened the Bible. And we'll maybe talk about those King James Bible passages and errors more in the second part. So some would theorize maybe for those parts he was consulting a Bible.
Right.
You said none of the witnesses claimed that he had a manuscript or notes or that he was opening a Bible. So you would think more that it was appearing on the stone in more of a sort of tight translation, that he's reading it and that God was revealing the Book of Mormon text in King James Bible language.
So, yeah, we can maybe parse that a little bit down the road here, but I would like to distinguish between a tight transmission of the text and a tight translation of the text. So what I mean is the eyewitness testimony, I think, is very clear, and I think Skousen is right about this, that the transmission, how the words got transmitted from Joseph Smith dictating to being recorded by Oliver to being published, that transmission was very tight and controlled. And Joseph Smith and his scribes were involved at every step very closely and minutely in that process. It wasn't haphazard. It wasn't accidental. However, the bigger sort of, if you want to say meta question, is where are the words coming from, the English words in the stone, where are they coming from, and what manner of a translation is that? This is where Brant Gardner has pushed back a little bit against Skousen's views, just to say that while Skousen provides a very good case for a tight transmission, there still is a lingering question of what nature of a translation of it. And this is where we get more into, we have to make more inferences based on the English text, because obviously the Ur text, the gold plates, are not extant, they're not available for our examination. And so based on the English text, we have to make inferences or judgments on what kind of a translation do we think it is. And that's where you get varying degrees of loose versus tight translation. And so, we can get into that a little bit more perhaps when we talk about King James Bible citations in the Book of Mormon. But I think Skousen is absolutely right that the transmission is tight. Brett Gardner agrees on that too, by the way. But that's different than the translation itself. And so we can get into that. But you have kind of a sense here. Latter-day Saints have different approaches to this. Again, B.H. Roberts, he thought, and others, I think even Sidney Sperry, if I'm not mistaken, but certainly B.H. Roberts, he thought that, and B.H. Roberts by no means was a disbeliever, despite what some people will tell you. B.H. Roberts, he said, Joseph Smith just popped open a Bible when he came to these passages where he saw biblical citations, and he just read from the King James Bible. So believing faithful Latter-day Saints and those who accept Book of Mormon historicity have acknowledged that as well. But we'll maybe address that a little bit later. Let's, maybe take a few minutes to talk about the seer stone versus Urim and Thummim, right? So the eyewitness accounts from those involved are very clear that Joseph Smith is using seer stones in the process of translating the Book of Mormon. The problem that we have is he using what the Book of Mormon calls interpreters, what the Nephites called interpreters, or spectacles. What Joseph Smith later, spectacles, that's how Joseph Smith describes them. That's how others describe them. Later they get called the Urim and Thummim by Joseph Smith. But yeah, spectacles is the other name. Is he using these? And look, they're stones. Joseph Smith describes them as white stones set in rims, right? Like a bow. So they're still seer stones. Is he using these seer stones from the ancient Nephites? Or is he using what is described as this sort of chocolate colored egg-shaped small seer stone that the church published photographs of several years ago? Which instrument is he using and when is he using it? This has become a matter of controversy for some people. There is even a recent movement of people pushing back against the idea that he ever used the seer stone.
That's right.
I'm just going to say seer stone to mean the dark egg-shaped seer stone on the bottom there, right? And I'll use Urim and Thummim to talk about the spectacles. There are some who are saying Joseph Smith never used the seer stone. Others saying that he only used
Foundation and the Stoddards,
right? So the Joseph Smith Foundation. Yeah, they're pushing that narrative here, that revisionist narrative. So there's controversy over this. For my judgment, I think it's very clear from the documentary record that Joseph Smith used both. We have firsthand eyewitness accounts of people, Joseph Smith, Oliver Cowdery, Emma Smith, Martin Harris, David Whitmer, all involved in the translation of the Book of Mormon, who describe him using one or the other. The problem that I see and others have is that the terminology that is used by the eyewitnesses is not consistent. And so the accounts they leave, most of which are reminiscent accounts, they tend to conflate or confuse the language so that it's not always clear which one we're talking about. And I'll kind of give you an example here coming up in the next slide. So this is where our problem we run into. Also, we run into the problem of what stage of the translation. Are we talking about late 1827 to mid 1828? Are we talking about the stage where he's translating with Oliver Cowdery? Depending on that, we have different accounts saying he may have used different instruments at different times. And so there's some confusion there. Now, people have pointed out that in Joseph Smith's history, canonized in the Pearl Great Price, and another sort of quote unquote official, quote, correlated church material sometimes, the Urim and Thummim, the spectacles, are only mentioned and the seer stone is not mentioned. So this, I think, speaks more to the fact, not so much that there has been like a concerted effort to quote unquote hide all of this material. Knowledge of Joseph Smith's use of the seer stones has been in print for a long, long time. No one's been hiding this from you. You can find it in the published sources. Rather, the question becomes when one of the accounts, Joseph Smith's account, which mentions the Urim and Thummim but not the seer stone, when that takes on canonical significance because it gets canonized in the Pearl Great Price, that tends to then overshadow as a sort of institutional cultural history within the church. That tends to overshadow the other accounts of Joseph Smith using the seer stone. Again, I don't think it's because of anything nefarious going on here. I think this is just kind of how cultural, institutional memory and history works. I know Steve Harper has talked with you about how the first vision becomes a sort of cultural memory and an institutionalized history for the church writ large. We see a similar thing happening with the use of the Urim and Thummim over the seer stone. So whereas Joseph Smith...
Do you think some of the past leaders like, Bruce R. McConkie or Joseph Fielding Smith, they would have been aware of, some of the seer stone accounts, but they just consider them as not credible?
Well, certainly. So in Joseph Fielding Smith's case, right, as the church historian, he has to make a judgment call when he knows about these accounts. As a historian, he has to then make a judgment call. How much credence do we give to them? How much do we trust them? Do we prioritize them over Joseph Smith's account? And how much do we do that? So these are questions of judgment, not questions of nefarious intent. I think the people that make that jump are jumping the gun here when they say Joseph Fielding Smith and his son-in-law, Bruce R. McConkie, when they said seer stones aren't real, they weren't used. That's not, I think, because there's a big conspiracy to hide the truth from anybody. It's because in their judgment as apostles and as church historian, they had to grapple with this data like the rest of us do, and they made judgment calls. And the quality of those judgment calls may vary depending on what data they have, right? And their interpretive assumptions, their backgrounds, their biases, all of these go into the mix to the decision of Joseph Fielding Smith to de-emphasize or to deny the use of seer stones. But for every Joseph Fielding Smith you have out there, you have other church historians and other church leaders who have no problem with Joseph Smith using the seer stone. Very famously, then elder, now President Russell M. Nelson in the early 90s delivered an address to MTC presidents that later gets published in the Ensign, where he quotes extensively and verbatim David Whitmer's account of Joseph Smith using a seer stone, right? So it's not just a one-sided deal where forever and always the church has hidden the truth about seer stones. It's rather a conflict of interpretation and a conflict of judgments as people have grappled with the historical data, trying to make sense of which one they emphasize or prioritize.
Right. And do you have any thoughts to why you think Joseph Smith might not have emphasized the seer stone when he's retelling the history? Because some people are a little bit maybe concerned or perplexed, that he used the seer stone, in folk magic or in treasure digging. And perhaps, it's Joseph maybe trying to leave behind some of those magical parts of his history, because he's getting maybe criticized by, like the Hurlbut affidavits for his involvement in treasure and things. So do you think it's perhaps him trying to move away from sort of like the magical folklore of his history?
I think that very well could be the case. The problem is we can't say for sure because Joseph Smith never told us for sure why he ends up emphasizing one over the other. We can't read his mind about it, but I think that's a reasonable inference to make as to why in his later published accounts of the translation, he emphasizes one over the other. I know Mark Ashurst McGee and Steve Harper, again, have both written on this. I think from a pretty good perspective to say that Joseph Smith's youthful involvement with folk magic, quote unquote, folk magic, and that's a whole other conversation, that acts as a sort of preparatory step towards him becoming a prophet and receiving the prophetic mantle. and that how you disentangle those two things may not always be clear in Joseph Smith's mind, or maybe it takes an evolution of his thinking to sort of leave that behind. So I think that's a reasonable inference to make. I think that's a reasonable argument, but I wouldn't go so far as to say, oh, this is absolutely why, just because we can't say for sure, because Joseph Smith never says so. What we can say for sure from the documentary record is that Joseph Smith ends up putting the emphasis, the narrative emphasis, on his use of the Urim and Thummim, the spectacles, over the seer stone. However, he is still showing people the seer stone, because we know that he shows the seer stone to the Quorum of the 12 in Nauvoo in 1841, because Wilford Woodruff famously records, Joseph Smith showed us the Urim and Thummim. I also have recently published an article arguing, I think it's pretty likely Joseph Smith used the seer stone in the translation of the Book of Abraham. That just got published by the Religious Studies Center at BYU a few months ago. So if you look on the Religious Studies Center website, you can find my article there. There's pretty decent chance he's still using the seer stone after the translation of the Book of Mormon. So that also complicates this narrative, perhaps, that he was trying to move away from it later. We just can't say for sure. And some arguments
and my
are reasonable.
understanding, as well as the Urim and Thummim, is sort of used both for the spectacles. It can be used interchangeably for the spectacles or the seer stone, that they're both sort of seeric devices.
Right. That's exactly right. I think that's why the terminology becomes confused, is because they both do the same thing. The Nephite interpreters and Joseph Smith's personal seer stone, they are both used for the purpose of receiving revelation to translate this book that Joseph Smith has. And therefore, I believe in the minds of the participants, they both fall under this broader category of Urim and Thummim, which tends to pretty quickly become the sort of standard nomenclature that Latter-day Saints use to describe these things, right? William Phelps sort of gets them kicked off on this train, and Joseph Smith and others, Oliver Cowdery, they sort of adopted. So I think you might be right.
And not to go off on a tangent, because we want to focus on the Book of Mormon, but some critics can point to that, if he used the same seer stone in sort of treasure digging, I'm not aware of any accounts of them, finding treasure, and some people might view it as, was it fraudulent? Was he a con man? Maybe some faithful scholars might view it as this was maybe him experimenting in sort of magical folklore, or some people really believed he had this gift to see in the stones, and perhaps he could find, like lost objects and things. But when it came to treasure digging, that they never found any treasure. And some people are concerned that, he used the same sort of methods and the same, the stone in the hat for the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. And does that call into question the credibility of the Book of Mormon if it was the same method he used in treasure digging, but they didn't find any treasure? Do you have any quick thoughts on that? I know it could be a totally different topic.
Sure.
And we'll not go down that way.
They're good questions. It's not one that has a simple answer, because the first thing you have to do is you have to unpack, what do you mean by quote unquote folk magic? And people today especially like to disentangle magic from religion. Religion is a good authorized thing that you're allowed to do. Magic is a bad fraudulent thing, or it's a bad evil satanic thing that you're not allowed to do. But those neat distinctions almost certainly did not exist in Joseph Smith or his family's minds, or many other Christians at the time in early antebellum America. It's not just the Smith family doing this. There are many pious, believing Christians who believe that the use of divining rods or seer stones are a legitimate, authorized expression of Christian practice in religion, right?
Yeah.
So that's the first problem we have, is I want you to give me a working definition of magic and religion that isn't special pleading or isn't arbitrary, because basically nobody can. The second point is, was Joseph Smith a consciously fraudulent con man? That's the narrative that his neighbors and many others quickly devise about him, is that it's not just that he was using seer stones, he was using seer stones to deceive and manipulate and con people, right?
Yes.
So there's that. You can take that approach with it. But again, the people closest to Joseph Smith who end up believing him don't believe that about him. So people are aware, for example, I'm sure, of the 1826 trial in Bainbridge, New York. Joseph Smith gets hauled before a justice of the peace for, quote, glass looking, right? He's charged with being a disorderly person. Is he convicted or not? We don't know, because we don't have the court records. We have different accounts of the outcome of the court. But guess who comes to his defense in all of this? Is Josiah Stoll. The guy who he supposedly is conning, because it's Josiah Stoll's nephews that bring up the charges. Josiah Stowell comes to Joseph Smith's defense and say, no, this guy actually has a real gift. I believe it. I sincerely believe that he actually can find things with a stone. So at what point do you grant a sincerity of belief for the participants versus, oh, they're just all making it up and they're just con men and Joseph Smith is trying to trick everybody, right? Again, that's a leap. That's a judgment leap that you have to make by prioritizing the accounts of people that don't like Joseph Smith, who don't know Joseph Smith, or who have it out for Joseph Smith. When you look at the people who know him better, who trust him, who believe him, they see sincerity in him. So we're kind of spinning the wheels here, but in my judgment, I think that we have to disentangle what is magic and religion. I want to see some good evidence that Joseph Smith is consciously fraudulent. I don't think the evidence is there. I think the evidence is that he was sincere in his quote unquote magical practices, that he and others close to him sincerely believed he had this gift. So then what you say at that point, and then I'll stop filibustering here, but what you have to say at that point is, are you okay with God allowing people to have maybe sincere misbeliefs or sincere superstitions, if you want to say it right? Can Joseph Smith sincerely believe something that ends up not being true, let's say, right? Folk magic or seer stones or whatever, right? So that's an individual faith call, an individual judgment call that people have to make. Does God allow people to participate, including prophets? Does he allow them to participate in cultural practices that we today no longer accept or recognize? There's that aspect of it. Or you can say, well, God is always in the equation. What doesn't matter is the rock he's using. What matters is that the power of God is working through the instruments.
Right. No, appreciate that. I think Dan Vogel would also agree with you that the folk magic was very common, and it wasn't this dark, black magic, satanic. It was almost blended with religion as part of their worldview. And people have to decide for themselves, could God have still used it as an instrument, sort of a focal device to reveal the Book of Mormon through.
And that's ultimately, yes. Yeah, I was just going to say that's ultimately a theological or religious belief, right? That's not something that you can show, prove in the historical record. You have to make an individual judgment call whether you're okay believing that.
Got you. Okay.
But just to wrap up here real quick at this section of it, I just want to read this account from Jonathan Hadley to give you a sense of, the fact that Joseph Smith is giving a pretty consistent story early on, and B, to show you my point about the confusion in the terminology that people are using when it comes to the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. So a quick recap, Jonathan Hadley is a printer in Palmyra. He is approached by Joseph Smith to perhaps contract the publication of the Book of Mormon and the publishing of the Book of Mormon. Jonathan Hadley is rivals with E.B. Grandin, who's the other printer there in Palmyra. And Jonathan Hadley records this account. And notice the date, August 1829. So this is like a month or two after the Book of Mormon has been finished. The copyright has been filed. Joseph Smith is now looking for a publisher. He approaches Hadley, and pay attention to how closely this mirrors Joseph's own account given later, for example, in his 1838 history, in his 1842 history. So this is republished by the Rochester. Rochester is the next town over, going west in New York. They republished the original published by Hadley, and here's what it says. The Palmyra Freeman says, the greatest piece of superstition that has ever come within our knowledge now occupies the attention of a few individuals of this quarter. So right off the bat, you can tell what Hadley thinks about this, right? A great piece of superstition. It is generally known and spoken of as the Golden Bible. That's the go-to phrase people use to describe this thing in the early accounts, in the early press accounts at least. Its proselytes give the following account of it. And by proselytes, probably meaning Joseph Smith himself, and or Oliver Cowdery, and or Martin Harris, people who were involved in the publication of the book, because they're the ones who approach Hadley. In the fall of 1827, a person by the name of Joseph Smith of Manchester, Ontario County, reported that he had been visited in a dream by the Spirit of the Almighty, and informed that in a certain hill in that town was deposited this Golden Bible, containing an ancient record of a divine nature and origin. After having been thrice thus visited, again, in Joseph Smith's 1838 history, that's what he says. Moroni came to him 3 times. And after penetrating Mother Earth a short distance, the Bible was found, together with what? With a huge pair of spectacles. There's that language of spectacles.
Yeah.
He had been directed, however, not to let any mortal being examine them under no less penalty than instant death. They were therefore nicely wrapped up and excluded from the vulgar gaze of the poor wicked mortals. And those who talk about handling the plates, members of the Smith family, Martin Harris, others, they talk about them being wrapped up in like a toe frock or in a shirt or something, or in a burlap bag, right? So again, this harmonizes pretty nicely. It was said that the leaves of the Bible were plates of gold, about 8 inches long, 6 wide, and 1/8 of an inch thick. That's very close, if not identical, to the dimensions Joseph Smith gives in the Wentworth letter in 1842. So we have a pretty consistent description of the dimensions of the plates. And on which were engraved characters or hieroglyphics. And now here's our key part. You ready? By placing the spectacles in a hat and looking into it, Smith could, he said so at least, Hadley wants to make sure that, this is what he's claiming, not me. Smith could, he said so at least, interpret these characters. So one of our earliest, in fact, I believe our earliest published account of the translation of the Book of Mormon is not coming from a Latter-day Saint or a believer, one of Joseph Smith's supporters or family. It's coming from this newspaper publisher, Jonathan Hadley, who says that Joseph Smith told him, I put the, quote, the spectacles in a hat and I look into it and I can interpret the characters. There's your stone in the hat translation right there, as early as August. Another source supporting it. So, but notice he doesn't call it Urim and Thummim. He doesn't call it seer stone. He calls it spectacles. So does that mean that Joseph Smith put the brown seer stone in the hat and they were calling that the spectacles? Did he put the actual Nephite interpreters in the hat? How is he using these things? We don't know for sure because, again, our accounts aren't always consistent. But what is consistent is this picture that Joseph has an instrument, a seer stone. He's putting it in his hat. He's looking at it in some way. And in some of these accounts, like this one, he puts it in the hat so he can look into it and interpret the characters, right? So August 1829, from a non-Latter-day Saint source, we have a early corroborative account of how the Book of Mormon is translated. Hadley goes on to say, an account of this discovery was soon circulated. The subject was almost invariably treated as it should have been, with contempt. So now we get back to Hadley kind of editorializing what he thinks about all of this. A few, however, believed the golden story, including, among whom was, hey, look at that, Martin Harris, an honest and industrious farmer. Wait, sorry. How is Martin Harris being described by his contemporary? Honest and industrious farmer of this town. Hey, look at that. The later accounts from Latter-day Saints who talk about, no, Martin was a nice, honest guy, and everybody thought so. We have early corroboration for that, about something about Martin Harris's nature. An honest and industrious farmer of this town, Palmyra. But so blindly enthusiastic was Harris. This is what his contemporaries say. Harris was an honest, nice, sincere guy, but he was kind of crazy because he was into all this religious stuff. So blindly enthusiastic was Harris that he took some of the characters interpreted by Smith and went in search of someone besides the interpreter who was learned enough to English them. We don't use English enough as a verb these days, I feel like. Who was learned enough to English them. But all to whom he applied, among the number was who? Professor Mitchell. Hey, Samuel Mitchell. He shows up later in Joseph Smith's history. He shows up in Martin Harris, right? As one of the guys Martin visits. Was Professor Mitchell of New York. He happened not to be possessed of sufficient knowledge to give satisfaction. Harris returned and set Smith to work at interpreting the Bible. He has at length performed the task, and the work is soon to be put to press in Palmyra. And then I love the final conclusion here, the final sentence. Its language and doctrine are said to be far superior to those of the Book of Life! 3 exclamation marks, right? So he's so he and others are scandalized at this new Golden Bible because Joseph Smith and others are saying that it's comparable to the Bible, and that is scandalous for Protestants in Joseph Smith's day. So again,
I guess a lot of the historical elements quite spot on, isn't there?
Right, and this is early good corroboration of the broad picture of what Joseph Smith reports in his history, of what others report about the coming forth. So we see this corroboration, but also notice again, we have spectacles in a hat, and Joseph Smith is looking at it and he's interpreting. This is our picture we get. Whether it's a Urim and Thummim, whether it's a seer stone, that is less clear, but they both are involved. That I feel very confident in saying.
Right, because some people think that, because I know there's a quote from Emma Smith, she talks about the spectacles being used mostly for the 116 pages with Martin Harris, and then he's kind of switched to the seer stone. A lot of the accounts from like David Whitmer, Martin Harris, and like Joseph Knight Sr., and they support sort of like it was the seer stone used in, for the Book of Mormon as we have it today. But are you saying that we can't necessarily state when he was using the spectacles and then when he was just using the stone?
I would be much more cautious with that, yes, because I'll go back here. I'll be much more cautious with that because the accounts tend to be very late and they tend to not be consistent. And so yes, Emma talks about him using the Urim and Thummim. Lucy Mack Smith talks about him using the Urim and Thummim at first, but then Martin Harris also reports him using the seer stone down in Harmony, right?
Because he tries to swap the stone, doesn't he, when he's his scribe? So he could have been using the seer stone during the 116 pages as well.
That's right. But then Oliver Cowdery, in his 1835 account, and this is also in the Pearl Price as the little footnote at the end, he says Joseph Smith used the what the Nephites would have called interpreters, right, to translate the Book of Mormon. So Oliver Cowdery seems to be saying that he's using the Urim and Thummim in April to June during their portion of the translation. My point here, from my perspective, we have to be much more cautious, try to pin down when is he using which instrument. I feel comfortable saying he's using both. I'm less comfortable being able to pinpoint when he's using which one, because again, I think our accounts aren't consistent.
Right. And I feel like those people from the Joe Smith Foundation who deny so many of the accounts of the seer stone in the hat, like they're denying people like Emma Smith and Martin Harris and David Whitmer and like Joseph Knight Sr. Like they're credible, witnesses. Yes. And to just say it was only the spectacles, the Urim and Thummim was never the seer stone, they're not credible. There's so much eyewitness testimony that they're having to deny, which are like faithful, right, and talk about how it was miraculous by the gift and power of God. So I feel like they're having to deny a lot of sources because they don't obviously like the narrative or the implications.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. What kills me about the Joseph Smith Foundation folks that are pushing the anti-seer stone narrative, the people that talk about Joseph Smith using a seer stone, Emma, David, Martin, others, they always do it in the context of this thing was a miracle. And I know it's a miracle because I saw him using the stone and he dictates this book and it comes and they have no other explanation other than God inspired Joseph to do this. And so they are not doing it to undermine credibility in Joseph Smith. That's what his skeptics are doing because they think it's all stupid hocus pocus, right? But the believers who are involved in the thing, they all think it's a miracle and coming from God. And so it's so self-defeating to try to argue against these sources and against their credibility. It's especially egregious to try to argue against David Whitmer just because he ended up being excommunicated and having problems with Joseph Smith. It's problematic. It's shot through with problems, to say the least. So I concur with you there. But to summarize here, and then we can move on to the witnesses, perhaps. So as I said, there is a robust historical literature on the coming forth, the translation, and the publication of the Book of Mormon. I've just scratched the surface on what's been written, but I gave some examples, both some books and some standalone articles that I recommend. Latter-day Saint authors, historians, textual critics, manuscript critics, they have pieced together, in my judgment, a very compelling case for the historical grounding of Joseph Smith's account of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. You hear this narrative sometimes that, and it's actually kind of really bugs me, but you hear people who will say things like, well, the big mistake Joseph Smith made was starting a religion in the 19th century when people were literate in printed books, right? Because the implication of that, they seem to say, is that we have so much documentary evidence that it just sort of shoots holes through Joseph Smith's claims. On the contrary, I'm really grateful that Joseph Smith published and translated the Book of Mormon at a time when we can have a robust documentary record, because I believe it gives us a very compelling and grounded case for the authenticity of his account. And I'm not just the one doing this, many others have written on it too. I also have to again insist that this evidence is very often ignored or it is not adequately accounted for by those who advance a naturalistic counter explanation or counter origin for the Book of Mormon. Going back to Richard Bushman's quote, I find that is historical malpractice, just as I find it historical malpractice what the Joseph Smith Foundation people are doing by trying to discredit these sources because they personally don't like seer stones because they think folk magic is evil and satanic or whatever. It's problematic in both ways.
Right.
And I think when you look at the data with a clear head, you at least have to acknowledge the bare bones of what I just laid out here. Whether or not you attribute that to a divine miracle or not, that's an individual judgment call, but you can't get around the bare bones details of the translation and the composition and the publication itself.
Got you. And we touched on, earlier the tight versus loose translation briefly in your view, but I think you would agree with me here. My view of when you read the accounts of the witnesses of the translation process, like Emma, Martin Harris, David Whitmer, they would support very much quite a tight word for word translation, that he was, the spiritual light would appear in the stone. He's reading the English translation to them. And some of them, would say that the sentence wouldn't disappear until it was written down correctly. And maybe we'll come back to that when we talk about maybe, errors or changes to the text. But it's definitely, they believe in a very tight, literal word for word translation, according to either what they were perceiving was happening, or if that's what Joe Smith was telling them was the method. But some scholars have moved towards more of a loose translation method, that it wasn't him reading it from the stone, and it's more revelation. He was putting it into his own vocabulary to account for some things. But some critics feel like that's maybe pushing, or that's contradicting what the witnesses were stating was happening in the translation process. And again, none of us know, other than Joseph Smith, exactly what was happening in the stone. We just have sort of like the witness historical sources.
Right. And you're right that people like David Whitmer, they absolutely believe in a very quote unquote tight translation of the Book of Mormon. So you're right that that's their understanding or their belief that they report when they talk about their understanding of the translation. Again, the valuable contribution that I think Brent Gardner has made to all this is to take a step back and first ask, where are the English words coming from that Joseph is seeing in the stone? And to what degree is Joseph Smith's own mental capacity and linguistic capacity, to what extent did that influence what he's seeing in the stone? That's a more bigger meta question of, again, what kind of a translation? I agree, and Skousen makes a good case that the manuscript evidence tends to align with the eyewitness accounts, that the text is being seen and dictated carefully, and that it's being tightly controlled and transmitted. They seem, especially David Whitmer, seems to take it a step further and say the translation also is coming from God, which is one of the reasons why he has some problems with later revelations Joseph Smith gives, because he has a problem with it. He's revising them and things like that. So certainly David Whitmer takes the next step in his report to say, not only was Joseph seeing the words in the stone, but those words were coming from God directly, word for word, right? So he absolutely makes that claim. And you can, if you want to sort of make that argument, right? But I see, again, Brent Gardner very persuasively telling us to take a step back and look more carefully, or ask the question, where are the words coming from to begin with? There's absolutely inspiration. It's done by the gift and power of God. That absolutely is true. That's what Joseph Smith says. That's what I believe. But what remains unanswered is, what does that mean exactly, and where are the words coming from in the stone? So, but we can perhaps get to that in a little bit here. But yes, you're right about that.
Jump to the witnesses.
Let's jump to the witnesses. So everybody knows, when you read the Book of Mormon, you have the testimony of the witnesses. There's 3 of them who say that they saw an angel and that they heard the voice of God declare the translation was correct. And then there's 8 other guys who all say that, hey, Joseph Smith just showed us these plates and we handled them and we turned the pages and we saw the characters, right? So let's say a little bit about the witnesses. Again, I'm going to kind of do something of a book report here, but I'll give some of the summary, at least my judgment on this. As with the origins of the Book of Mormon, the documentary record is robust when it comes to the Book of Mormon witnesses. Guys like David Whitmer and Martin Harris, they live into the 1870s and 1880s. They give tons of interviews, especially David Whitmer. They give tons of interviews. So we have a big, robust documentary record for them. Again, the sources closest to the witnesses, so I'm talking about immediate family, for example, or spouses, to say nothing of the witnesses themselves, in my judgment, are strongly favorable towards the view of their credibility and their truthfulness and their sincerity. Okay. Yes. And I'll break that down a little bit. I think, again, like with the translation of the Book of Mormon, our best primary sources paint this positive picture of who these people were, right? Skeptics, and that includes both contemporary skeptics from the 19th century and people today, they typically rely on or give preference to second or third hand or unsourced accounts or hostile accounts, and they downplay, or in even some egregious cases, they misrepresent what the witnesses themselves or what the primary sources said about their experience. That may come across as kind of strong, but I think that has been shown abundantly in the literature. I won't give away too much here, but I'll talk about it in a second. But again, like with the publication and translation of the Book of Mormon, I'm frustrated by how I see historical malpractice being done on the part of skeptics who want to give preference or give more reliability to these other more problematic sources than to the witnesses themselves or to those in their immediate families, right? Their immediate close associates.
Yeah, because one thing I noticed whenever I, read, through maybe some like critical places like, like the CS letter and its section on the witnesses is they focus primarily on, a few, like secondary or even third-hand statements that make it seem like they didn't really see the plates. It was just second sight or spiritualize or all their imagination. And there's dozens of first-hand, maybe more than dozens, but I've certainly read dozens of first-hand primary statements from the 3 witnesses and some from the 8 witnesses that make it seem like they really did see the plates. The 3 witnesses saw the angel. They had a vision. They really did see the gold plates. I would like to get your thoughts on is it the Stephen Burnett?
Stephen Burnett, yes.
Because I had a discussion with Dan Vogel on this, and he said, so I think the quote goes something like, the last pedestal of his testimony gave way when Martin Harris publicly said that none of was it the 3 witnesses and the 8 witnesses?
It's the 8, yeah.
The 8 witnesses saw the plates with their natural eyes, but kind of like with their spiritual eyes. Or in vision.
In
I might be
vision.
butchering the quote, but something like that.
No, that's okay. Yeah. So we'll get to. Let's show that for just a second here because I have something to say about that. But yes, we can mention Stephen Burnett. But that's one of the sources, for example, that people tend to gravitate to or give sort of preferential treatment to. I believe at the expense of better, stronger evidence. Stephen Burnett is a source. He's a data source. You have to take him into account. But people tend to sort of enshrine him as if he's the end all be all of what the witnesses experienced. But we'll get there in just a second.
No problem. So I'm jumping ahead.
No, that's okay. No, these are good questions. So that's kind of my sort of summary wrap on the witnesses. Let me run through kind of the literature review. So Preston Nibley publishes in, I want to say 1946, I think is when he publishes this book, The Witnesses of the Book of Mormon. He just basically compiles what we had then in 1946, our primary accounts from the witnesses themselves. This kind of spun a good little robust historical treatment into the witnesses that Richard Lloyd Anderson spearheaded. Back in the 60s and the 70s, he wrote some articles for the Improvement Era and then in the Ensign and BYU Studies and places like that. And it culminated with his book published in 1981, which in my judgment is still one of the best books written in Mormon history, Investigating the Book of Mormon Witnesses. Even the fact that it was published in 1981, it's really, really good stuff that Richard Lloyd Anderson did here. And he pioneered a lot of this great work on the witnesses. So we've had this nice sort of trajectory going here in the mid 20th century of people writing on the witnesses. Preston Nibley's work is now totally out of date just because we found a lot more sources since his time, but it was commendable for its day, what he was able to do. Rich Lloyd Anderson's book still holds up very well, and it's still in print. So it's still accessible. You can get it online for pretty cheap.
I've listened to him on Fair Mormon and some of his articles as well. He's recently passed away, hasn't he, in the past decade? Is that right?
Yeah, well, past year or so. Yeah, past couple of years. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, he's done a lot of great work on the witnesses.
Yes, I agree. I commend Anderson's work, both his book and his more recent work that's been published online, various journal articles and so forth. He was working on the Oliver Cowdery papers when he died. So hopefully someday somebody can take that up and can publish Oliver Cowdery's papers, because I know that's what he was working on at the time of his death recently. So we'll see there. But more recently, here are some standalone articles that I recommend that have been done recently. So there's Stephen Harper on the left, published with the Religious Studies Center about 10 or so years ago. Larry Morris published this in Dialogue just about 2 years ago, I think. This is a spin-off article from his book, Documentary History of the Book of Mormon that I mentioned. He has 2 sections on the 3 witnesses and the 8 witnesses, and this is his sort of spin-off article summarizing his research and what he has found. And basically what Morris is able to show is that whatever else you think, Joseph Smith was showing an object to people who were handling it. That much is very clear from what you get here. They don't necessarily have to be ancient plates. You don't necessarily have to believe that per se, although you should. But you can say, at a minimum, you have to be saying that there are witnesses, people who describe tangible encounters with these plates, with these objects. And Gail Anderson, this is published in the Journal of Mormon History, again, about 10 years ago, basically says the same thing. So this is still an ongoing area of inquiry. They're still writing on this. As a matter of fact, I myself am working on something right now, which I'll get to in just a second. But besides the official witnesses, so the guys whose names appear in the Book of Mormon, the 3 and the 8, there's also what you might call sort of the quote unquote unofficial witnesses of the Book of Mormon that people have known about for a long time now. So these are men and women who are not specifically called to be witnesses, right? So the 3 witnesses, there's even a revelation Joseph Smith gives saying these guys are supposed to be witnesses. So these are people who are not specifically official witnesses recorded in the Book of Mormon, but who nevertheless do leave accounts of encountering the plates and or Book of Mormon artifacts like the Urim and Thummim and or seeing the angel. The picture I have there was done recently. It's of Mary Whitmer. Mary Whitmer has the famous account preserved in her family of her being shown the plates by the angel. Emma Smith leaves accounts, right? Very famously, she has a description of, well, as I was doing my chores in the house, I would see the plates there wrapped up in the tow frock or wrapped in a cloth, and I would thumb I would thumb the edges, and they sounded like they felt like the leaves of a book, and they made a little clink or whatever, right? Josiah Stoll also reportedly caught a glimpse of the corner of the plates when he's passing them. So when Joseph brings them home, he's passing them through the window into the house in Manchester, and Josiah Stoll reportedly caught a corner of the plates. And William Smith records later in life having felt the plates under the cloth or in a box that had been made for the plates, right? The weight of these, pardon the pun, but the weight of these sources of people having tangible encounters is even now leading non-LDS scholars to acknowledge that Joseph had an object that other people handled. Yes. So Ann Taves and Sonia Hazard in the last couple of years, they're 2 non-Latter-day Saint scholars have written on this. And so like the trend now is to, when you are confronted by the body of the data, you have to acknowledge Joseph had an object that people are encountering in the real world, right? And this is just beyond whatever happened to the 3 and the 8 witnesses. This is just sort of everyday normal people, members of his family and his neighbors. We even have Isaac Hale. Again, Joseph's skeptical father-in-law reportedly said, they were in the box there and I lifted the box or whatever, but Joseph wouldn't let me see what was in the box. And so that's when I said, I don't want anything to do with this. So even skeptical accounts exist of people having encounters with these things. So at a minimum, you have to acknowledge there's an object Joseph has that people are encountering. Whether you want to take the next step and believe the testimony of the 3, that this was an ancient record, that an angel showed them, that's another question. But this at a minimum is what we see from the historical data.
That's funny. On a side note, I had a discussion with a family member over the past year who, left the church and lost their faith, but they didn't believe that the plates were even real or existed. And I had to tell them, there's too much historical evidence beyond the 3 and the 8 witnesses. All the other witnesses either claiming a visionary experience or just like, as you said, holding the plates as they were covered. It's definitely a historical artifact. And the question is either it was a divine ancient record, delivered to him by an angel, or he had to have created or fabricated a set of plates, as some, critics would speculate must have occurred. But there definitely was a set of plates.
Yes, I think that's absolutely the case, or at least that's what we can say very firmly from the historical evidence. Here's 2 recent spin-off articles on this that talk about what I just sort of went through. Anthony Sweat and Amy Easton Flake and Rachel Cope, all excellent scholars in their own right, who have summarized this evidence. And so your listeners are free to check this out for themselves. But yes, I think that's very clear. I would be remiss if I didn't recommend the wonderful documentary that Dan Peterson and the Interpreter Foundation put together recently. They put together both a movie, so a dramatic recreation of the experience of the witnesses, and also a nice documentary about the witnesses with an accompanying website that has resources, articles, things like that, right? So it's out there. There's a lot of fun, interesting things your listeners can look at if they want to get a sense of what we get through the historical data and the ways Latter-day Saints have sort of interpreted and committed that to things like film and whatever, right? And it's a nice little video. I've seen it.
I'd like to watch it. I think I've seen the trailer, but I'll have to order the DVD.
Yeah, I mean, I like it. For Mormon cinema, it's not bad, which is kind of a low hurdle to clear, right? Because Mormon cinema is not super great. But yeah, it's a nice, enjoyable film, I thought. And the documentary, they have a spin-off documentary as well. That's very interesting, where they interview both LDS and non-LDS scholars who talk about the witnesses and what they experienced. Now, forthcoming, let me just plug a couple of things. So I work right now, like I said, for the B.H. Roberts Foundation, and our website Mormoner, That's Mormon with an R.org. Mormoner.org will, in the very near future, have a Q&A on the Book of Mormon witnesses published on its website, which will include a database of primary sources. I've been working on this project to collect these sources and to put them online for free for people to access. And so probably later this month or early next month, I imagine this will go online most likely. So be sure to follow Mormoner.org to get this new material. Neal Rappleye, my friend and co-author Neal Rappleye, who I worked with at Book of Mormon Central, and we have written stuff together. We actually have an article forthcoming that specifically addresses the Stephen Burnett letter. So Murph, when you asked about Stephen Burnett, I wanted to wait just a second because we have it's now like 40 pages, manuscript pages of an article addressing Stephen Burnett. And the TLDR is that, so Stephen Burnett makes 5 specific claims about the 8 witnesses that he claims he got from Martin Harris. So the setting is Stephen Burnett and some other dissenters in Kirtland, including Martin Harris, with the fallout of the failure of the Kirtland Safety Society, they come together and they start a sort of an offshoot or a schismatic group in Kirtland, and they are debating whether or not they still believe the Book of Mormon. And there's members of the group who do believe the Book of Mormon, people like Joseph Coe, but then others like Warren Parrish and Stephen Burnett, and Martin Harris, of course, still believes it. And but Parrish and Burnett, they no longer believe the Book of Mormon. They think it's fraudulent. And Stephen Burnett, in this context in Kirtland, writes a letter to Lyman Johnson in April of 1838. He says to Lyman Johnson, I heard Martin Harris say in a meeting these things about the 8 witnesses, and he lists 5 specific things. Well, first of all, to my point earlier, right off the bat, this is a third-hand source, because this is Stephen Burnett saying that he heard Martin Harris say he heard this from the 8 witnesses. So right off the bat, you've got a problem with the fact that this is a third-hand hearsay account. The second problem you have is that Burnett makes specific claims about the 8 witnesses that are themselves contradicted by the 8 witnesses. And Neal Rappleye and I go through and we provide example after example where Burnett says something that he claims about the 8 witnesses that the 8 witnesses themselves contradict. For example, one of the things Burnett says is that Martin Harris said that the 8 witnesses were hesitant to sign their name to the printed testimony of the Book of Mormon. That's a pretty damning thing, right? They were kind of unsure, they were hesitant, they were uncertain. That is flatly contradicted by the people, the 8 witnesses who described them signing their name. That's just flatly contradicted that claim, that they were somehow hesitant or they were unsure. Another example is when Stephen Burnett says that, the 8 witnesses, they just basically acknowledge the Book of Mormon is false. Like they just sort of categorically ended up just, denying their testimony. Flatly contradicted by the 8 witnesses. Flatly contradicted by people like John Whitmer, who goes on to live for several more decades after he's excommunicated and repeatedly, unambiguously reaffirms both that he saw and handled the plates and that he believes the Book of Mormon is inspired, that it's a inspired scripture, book of scripture, right? So look forward to Neal and I. We have this article coming out that will specifically address Stephen Burnett. Others have as well. Steve Harper has, Richard Lloyd Anderson has, Larry Morris has. Stephen Burnett is an important data point that people have to grapple with and look at, but he is absolutely not the final say on this. As a matter of fact, he's not even the best say on this, on what the 8 witnesses experienced. For that, you should prioritize the 8 witnesses themselves. Without getting too much in the weeds, yes, the Stephen Burnett letter is interesting. Also, I will go ahead and say that Neal Rappleye and I will be responding in depth to Dan Vogel's use of Stephen Burnett, because we have some problems with the way that Dan Vogel and Grant Palmer and others have used Stephen Burnett as a source. And so we will critique their use of him as a source, in addition to scrutinizing his claims specifically. So look forward to that. There's other, I'm sorry to be a tease here. I hope it's not too bad. There are other top secret stuff in the works that are coming out here. I just say this to let your listeners know that the last word has not been said on the credibility of the witnesses. The scholarship is ongoing. The field is evolving, right? There's more contributions being made. And so they should hopefully keep their radar antenna pinged for those coming out here in the future, right? So the takeaway, unless there's anything else you want to ask or say about this point, Murph, but I
was thinking back to a video, and you're the presenter in it. I think it was on Book of Mormon Central, and you talk about how, we have the testimony of the 3 witnesses who are claiming a very supernatural visionary experience of the angel and the plates. You have the 8 witnesses, it's more of a natural, they just, held
Yes.
and saw the place, that there was nothing supernatural about it. And you could say if we just had the 3 witnesses, maybe it was a hallucination. If we just had the 8 witnesses, you could say maybe they were tricked with fake plates that Joseph Smith
Yep.
created. The combination of them and then all the other witnesses adds to, their testimonies having more credibility. And another wee thing I would add, I find this interesting, that in the Book of Mormon, it prophesies that 3 witnesses will see and hold the plates and by the power of God. And I find that, if Joseph Smith is the author, that's quite a risky thing to promise and prophesy, that 3 people will all have a vision of seeing an angel and the plates.
Yeah, I agree with you completely there. It would be audacious to say the least. And so if he was able to pull it off, then kudos to him, I guess, right? Because he was able to trick them or whatever. But yeah, as a believer, I believe that they were anciently prophesied and that this prophecy was fulfilled. And that these men you see right here, Joseph Smith has a revelation, Dean C. 18, 17? I can't remember offhand, but it's there's a revelation in the Doctrine and Covenants saying you'll call these 3 witnesses, right? And I feel like they fulfilled that testimony. So my takeaway from all of this is to say, I believe the historical evidence confirms the sincerity and the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon witnesses, right? At the very least, it confirms our sincerity.
Yes,
at the very least, you cannot show evidence for fraud, for duplicity, for mercenary motives, or, they're just in it for the money or whatever. At the very, very least, you have to acknowledge the historical evidence indicates they were sincere in what they said they believed and experienced, right?
Yes, because they never denied their testimonies, the experience, even after leaving the church and becoming disillusioned with Joseph Smith.
With Joseph Smith, yeah.
And there's even statements I remember reading from David Whitmer and Oliver Cowdery, because we can't eliminate, the possibility it could have been a hallucination, but they don't believe it was a hallucination. They don't believe it was, conjuring or Joseph Smith hypnotized them. They seem very sure about what they saw, and we can't just dismiss that at face value. We have to take it into account.
Well said. I completely agree. So we have at a minimum the evidence for their sincerity. I believe also a very good positive case for their truthfulness. I also have to insist that objections people make to the witnesses. So for example, you mentioned spiritual eyes. This is a phrase that comes up almost exclusively, I believe, with Martin Harris. So we have accounts of people who they claim they heard Martin Harris say, well, I saw the plates with my spiritual eyes, right? And they take that to mean, it was all just a hallucinatory thing or just in a vision or whatever. Faithful historians and Latter-day Saints have accounted for and have talked about this and have answered these objections. One of the top secret things that's coming out will be addressing this, but I can't say more than that. Again, sorry to be coy, but Latter-day Saint historians have known about this. It's not being caught off guard when we encounter the sources of Martin Harris saying he saw it with spiritual eyes. We've known about this. We've talked about this. We've explored what that could possibly mean. And I believe, for my money, I believe they have been adequately accounted for, which means that this doesn't diminish the truthfulness or the validity of their testimony. I believe skeptics have had to at times misrepresent the historical data to make their case, and I'm going to show that with Neal Rappleye in our forthcoming article. As great as work as Dan Vogel has done with collecting documents with his early Mormon document series, he's great with archival research. I believe that Dan's approach to the witnesses is subpar by historical standards, and partly what we will do in our forthcoming article is show examples of this. But Richard Lloyd Anderson has done this. Daniel C. Peterson has done this. Again, going back to this problem that Richard Bushman identified, this has tend to be sort of the typical thing you get, because the closer you get to these sources, the more uncomfortable it is for people who have a secular naturalistic worldview where they cannot countenance the existence of angels or gold plates or things like that. And like I said, there's plenty of examples already in the literature that I've cited. More examples are forthcoming. So I think that kind of does it for my take on the witnesses, if there's nothing else we want to say about that.
Can I just ask one wee question? Because some people would say, and I went through a phase where I was, because I went through a faith crisis and I've been on my own faith journey, and I left the church at one point and I was listening to loads of people's near-death experiences or visionary experiences, and I've even listened to people where maybe more than one person has claimed to have a vision some sort, and some people might think it doesn't, if they might have this, even if it's a mass hallucination experience, maybe there's other people that have had visionary experiences. Or when it comes to the plates, you have James Strang, and he had a set of plates and had witnesses. What would be your quick response to those people saying that, well, other people have had visionary experiences, or James Strang did a similar thing to Joseph Smith with his own plates and he had witnesses? Are they really that credible? What would be your quick response to that?
My quick response to the first is to say that not all visions are made equal, in my judgment, and not all of the accounts of people's visionary experiences have equal weight to their credibility, I would say. I am not the one to just be reflexively skeptical or dog on other people for having claimed visionary experiences. As a matter of fact, within my own religious worldview, I'm very comfortable with people of different religious traditions or backgrounds being open to having visionary or spiritual experiences like that. However, I guess I can just say, having carefully scrutinized the witnesses and their accounts of their visions, it's impressive to me. I would have to take it on a vision by vision basis, right? And sort of sit down with the person, look at their claims carefully. Most of the time, there's nothing we can say because it's just the individual saying, Bob Jones, Bob Smith had a vision one day. And that's fine. That's great. It's completely subjective. There's no way, and I can't prove it or disprove it or whatever, right? So you believe it or don't. But here you have three people saying they had a vision and a visionary experience, right? And now you're getting into, okay, do they have a consistent story? Are they believable? Are they credible? Do the details match? That sort of thing, right? And so once you have multiple people that you bring into the visionary experience, that's where you have more data to work with. And that, to me, makes me more comfortable to say, you know what? The fact that they're consistent with each other, the fact that they seem credible, the fact that they describe a similar experience, I believe they're believable. So I'd say that very quickly on your first point. On the point of James Strang, actually, yeah, he probably did have plates. Because there's nothing wrong with what the way he and his witnesses describe them. They found these plates buried in Vori, what's the place? Michigan, right? Yeah, Vori, Michigan, right? There's nothing problematic about that. He very well may have either found or more likely made these plates, right? Again, it's just like with the 8 witnesses. If all we had was the 8 witnesses saying, Joseph Smith showed us these plates, you can say, all right, cool, where did the plates come from? And you're open to say Joseph Smith could have made them. They're an artifice. They're a modern construct. I think you can say the same with James Strang, because as far as I'm aware, none of James Strang's witnesses talk about an angel showing them these plates, and that they heard the voice of God declare that James Strang's translation of the plates were correct. I could be mistaken, but I don't believe I am from what I've looked at this episode. So I don't necessarily fault James Strang's witnesses. I think they very well may have recovered or found an artifact that James Strang may have made or fabricated, and they straightforwardly describe their experience with encountering these things. Just like the same way, I don't have a problem saying people like Emma Smith and Lucy Mack Smith and William Smith and others straightforwardly describe encountering Joseph Smith's gold plates, right? So I don't see Strang as a deal breaker for the credibility of the witnesses because of the nature of what his witnesses described happening to them.
Gotcha. No, love those answers. Thank you.
Well, what do you think? Should we take a break here real quick, or stop here?
Do you want to finish this part? Do you want to finish evidence for the Book of Mormon textually and archaeologically, and then we'll take a break and then do part 2?
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, that's fine. So let's move on here. Let's go through this section real quick. So evidence for the Book of Mormon. So we've talked about the case for the translation and the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, the witnesses. What's our evidence that this thing is actually ancient? What's the evidence for the historicity? So in my judgment, and this is a metaphor that was used by a friend of mine and a colleague at BYU. I actually used to be his TA. He was a really great guy. He's looked very carefully at this subject, and he calls it death by 1,000 cuts when it comes to Book of Mormon evidence. And here's what I mean by that. So I'll be upfront, and I will say very clearly, for the record, I have no problem saying this. There's no single piece of definitive evidence for the histories of the Book of Mormon. There's no smoking gun where I can point to and say, this settles the question once and for all, and you all have to believe this thing, right? So I'm not saying that we are at this point with evidence for the Book of Mormon, right? However, I do believe very strongly, and this is where my metaphor comes in, it's a cumulative or snowball effect. So we have lots of little pieces of evidence that are snowballing into a bigger picture of this book is ancient. This is the death by 1,000 cuts that I'm talking about. It's a lot of little things adding up that make it a big thing, as opposed to just one big thing that proves it all on its own. So when I'm talking about categories of evidence for the Book of Mormon, in my mind, as I approach it, I have in mind external and internal evidences for the Book of Mormon. External would be situating it in a real world ancient geography. And what do we find through archaeological investigation? Okay, so stuff you find in the dirt and real places in the world that you can situate this book in. That's what I mean by external. For internal, I'm talking about the complexity of the text, and that includes its internal geography, right? So imagine the world as it is described in the text itself without actually trying to correlate it with the real world. The internal evidence indicates this nice, complex, consistent geography. I'm talking about the language of the text, so things like Hebraisms, which we'll touch on, and I'm talking about the onomasticon of the text, meaning the names that appear in the book. So we have these names, Nephi and Lehi and, things like that. That's what I'm talking about with the onomasticon. I'm also quick to emphasize that I'm not talking about proof here. So we're not talking about, again, something that will definitively once and for all show this thing is true, but rather to use the language of William Deaver and Brent Gardner, we're talking about convergence. And I'll define in a second what this is. So past attempts to look at the history of the Book of Mormon have been problematic from Latter-day Saints, in my judgment, because they've been looking for proof. They want to go down and they want to find Zarahemla in Guatemala and say, Zarahemla, welcome to Zarahemla, population 10,000 Nephites, right? That's what people like Thomas Stewart Ferguson were looking for. That's what even in the 19th century people were expecting and hoping for. We don't have that. And therefore, some people that damages their testimony, but rather it doesn't damage mine, but rather what we have right now are really compelling convergences between what the Book of Mormon describes and what we know about the ancient world. I would be remiss, and I know this is very self-serving because I used to work for them, but Book of Mormon Central is the group I worked for quite a few years, where we have put together a lot of these study resources that sort of highlight and discuss some of this evidence I'm talking about. There's also Evidence Central, which is a spin-off project from Book of Mormon Central. So Book of Mormon Central more broadly will cover doctrinal issues of the Book of Mormon or theological things, devotional applications, videos, as well as evidences. Evidence Central is devoted specifically to evidence, like what we're counting as evidence for the Book of Mormon and what that looks like and where it appears. So these are two resources online for free that your listeners can perhaps pursue, Book of Mormon Central and Evidence Central, to give a sense of what's out there. Probably most of your listeners, or many of them, are familiar with these two works. They probably know the name John L. Sorenson. Frankly, before John L. Sorenson, nobody did Book of Mormon geography seriously. Like, you have some guys who do some really interesting sort of pioneering work, but everything before John L. Sorenson is sort of amateurish at best, and really, really bad at worst in terms of their arguments, their evidence, things like that. So John Sorenson, for me, marks the beginning of like really serious Book of Mormon, especially New World, Mesoamerican evidence for the Book of Mormon. These are his two works. He also died a few years ago, so rest in peace, John L. Sorenson. But his books are accessible and available to give you a sense, sort of call it the school, the John L. Sorenson school that has been developed on Book of Mormon historicity coming from him.
I think most faithful scholars, as well as Brent Gardner, would sort of side with the John Sorenson, geographical model in Mesoamerica is the best sort of candidate or fit for the sort of geography being most consistent and aligning with the text of the Book of Mormon.
Right, yeah. So John Sorenson is known probably primarily for the fact that he championed a limited geography down in Central America, down in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec and sort of northern Guatemala, right? So he pioneered and championed this way of thinking. Full disclosure, I think he's right. I basically accept Sorenson's model as well, with some caveats or whatever. But broadly speaking, I think he has the right approach. We're talking about a limited geography in Mesoamerica. That's the position that I take as well. That's the position that Brent Gardner takes. I have his book here, Traditions of the Fathers, the Book of Mormon as History. I strongly and highly recommend this book for your listeners as a very good book, but also as a book that reflects well my own thinking on terms of Book of Mormon historicity.
Yeah, so I read his book recently and interviewed him as well. And we had a great interview, and he's a great scholar. So yeah, definitely listeners check out his book.
So you got from the horse's mouth, right? You've got the Murph recommending it too. So I'm not crazy here, but probably I'll be quick about this then, because you probably discussed it with Brent Gardner. But Brent has this really interesting methodology where he says we need to focus on how the Book of Mormon converges with the ancient world. So we're not talking about proofs; we're talking about convergence. And what he means by that is you find details in the text of the Book of Mormon. So the Book of Mormon describes something about the ancient world it purports to depict. Do we find attestation or parallel or justification or convergence with the real world through the tools of archaeology, which is the main tool, right? So, and he gives plenty of examples of this, but we're not talking about, okay, we found this thing and therefore this proves Nephites were real, but rather the thinking is what the Book of Mormon describes is consistent with what we see in the archaeological record, and therefore we have a convergence that bolsters the plausibility or bolsters the authenticity of its historicity, right? We're not rising the level of proof, but rather a sort of a preponderance of evidence or a growing amount of evidence when the convergence happen. So a singular convergence doesn't prove the book is true, but like I said, a preponderance of these convergences, they over time show a plausible setting in the ancient world where this book makes sense, but also they can illuminate how we read the book as a record from antiquity, okay? So if you look at these convergences, you begin to see how this book works as an ancient book, in addition to showing how it could plausibly be an ancient book, right? So it's kind of this, in a sense, reciprocal relationship between making sense of the text itself and also showing where it parallels or converges with the ancient world. I find this methodology vastly more better and significant and important than the older stuff from like Thomas Stewart Ferguson, who took a trial down to Mexico and tried to find Zarahemla and didn't find it and lost his testimony, right? And so I think when you follow this methodology, the results aren't as dramatic per se, because you don't necessarily find Zarahemla, but you do find lots of little convergences that overall build up to show how this record works as an ancient record. And it makes sense. It has a plausible setting, and you can approach it with that paradigm with confidence, I would say.
Right. It's more of an approach of plausibility than proof, things converging together, that it's plausible, that it lines up with historicity and archaeology and such.
Yes. Yeah, well said. So maybe we could run through a couple examples. We'll start off with my favorite example, because I think it's the best. It's the most powerful, convincing convergence we have. So Lehi's travel through Arabia from Jerusalem down to Bountiful, right? It's really remarkable. It's really awesome, I'll even say, to use vernacular language. It's awesome how well First Nephi lines up with what we know from pre-Islamic Arabian geography, topography, and geoclimate, right? And this has been written on to death. Latter-day Saints, at least going back to Hugh Nibley in the 1950s, but even more recently with people like Warren Aston and my friend Neal Rappleye and others, can show how this works. So we have a very probable route that Lehi is taking. We have, I don't want to say Nahom is proof, because it's still not proof, but it comes kind of close in my judgment when you look at how well Nahom converges with what is described in the Book of Mormon, with what we have from ancient Southwest Arabia. The onomasticon, like Ishmael, my friend Neal published a thing on this very recently. The onomasticon looks good. The geoclimate looks good. So when Nephi describes Bountiful, his description matches pretty well the Dhofar region of modern Oman, right there on the coast, right, where they build the ship. So you take all of these together, and it's not proving this thing is true, but as Hugh Nibley said all the way back in the 1950s, he said, anybody that wants to discount the Book of Mormon has to start with the first 20 chapters, has to start with First Nephi. You need to be able to explain away how all of this works, because it's really awesome. So this is sort of probably the most dramatic example of convergence happening as Brent Gardner describes it, is all these pieces come together, and what First Nephi describes matches up remarkably well with what we see in the real world through things like archaeology and other sciences. And so this bolsters its credibility. It shows a plausible ancient context. And if you even want to go as far as, you can ask, well, how does Joseph Smith come up with all of this, right? And that's another separate question, but you can kind of take it there if you want to take it in that direction.
I think as well, Stephen, I think a lot of critics or people who leave can really shrug off the parallels between Nahom and Bountiful, that, it's just NHM on an altar and apologists are just grasping at straws. But whenever I really did examine, the area that they're traveling through, the directions they're going, they're naming all these places, but then they say that they found a place that was called Nahom, and it's a burial site, and they buried Ishmael there, and isn't in Hebrew, Nehem means to mourn, and it's like the daughters of Ishmael mourned, and
Yep.
so there's a bit of a pun there, but it's in the right location. There's no vowels in Hebrew, but it has NHM, and then the direction they travel in the text links towards Bountiful. So it's definitely a strong and compelling candidate. If I would agree with you, it's not proof, but it's definitely, I think, convincing evidence that should be taken into account, not just dismissed. Because a lot of critics can say there's absolutely no evidence to support the historicity of the Book of Mormon. And I think this is it's somewhat compelling.
I have to agree. And Neal and I have written on this several years ago. We published an article on Nahom specifically. Since then, my friend Neal has been leading the charge on the cultural and geographical setting of First Nephi, the travel through Arabia. Neal has accepted for publication a paper. When I say exhaustive, I mean an exhaustive analysis of Nahom. It's not just one altar, it's a abundant corpus of inscriptions that we can look at. It's situating it in the geography, it's attestations for burial sites nearby, everything you just sort of described here, right? So I almost feel bold enough to say this. So when you look at like biblical, quote unquote, biblical archaeology and people trying to establish biblical sites. Okay, so you come across a tell somewhere in Syria or Israel or Palestine or whatever. Is this the biblical city of so-and-so? Well, what are our criteria? Well, do we have inscriptional evidence for it? Does it match with what's in the text? Does it make sense geographically, et cetera, right? Every criterion that secular scholars of ancient Southwest Asia or the ancient Near East or Syria, Palestine, all the criteria that they use to establish a good or plausible or certain candidate for a biblical site, Nahom satisfies all of them for the Book of Mormon. In fact, even better in some cases. If this wasn't connected with like gold plates and angels and seer stones and stuff, I feel very confident that this would not be controversial in linking the Book of Mormon Nahom with this site in Southwest Arabia, right?
Right.
It's the reason why it becomes uncomfortable for people is because suddenly angels and gold plates are involved, and the implications for all of that becomes uncomfortable for people. But I'm sorry, you have to kind of deal with it because the evidence is really good. Again, I will commend.
That's true, because if there can be historical evidence found to support, the Book of Mormon geography and the text, then that directly then supports the claim made by Joe Smith and the witnesses of the angel and the gold plates. Like if you can find historical things that support the Bible, it doesn't necessarily mean
right
Jesus' resurrection happened. But with the Book of Mormon, it kind of does.
It kind of does, right? And it raises these kind of uncomfortable implications because of how Joseph described how he got this book, right? So anyways, I don't want to dwell too much on this because I'm sure your listeners have heard it all before, but this is just to say, this is my go-to example to illustrate how this works. I'm not saying this proves it. Everybody, come join the LDS church and get baptized or whatever, although you should because it's nice. But this is really, really good. Okay, so there's Nahom in Arabia. I like the Onomasticon. So this just got published this year, Dictionary of Proper Names and Foreign Words in the Book of Mormon. The Onomasticon, so the names that appear in the Book of Mormon, a preponderance of them are either outwardly attested or they are plausible ancient Semitic and Egyptian names. And when I say attested, I mean like we have them in other inscriptions and they are exactly the name we have in the Book of Mormon. Offhand, Sam, right? Like we have Sam. That's a good one because Sam was accused of being a Yankeeism in the Book of Mormon. Oh, ancient Hebrews didn't call their kid Sam. That's Joseph Smith and his Yankeeism, right? No, like that's an attested in the epigraphic sources that's just a hypochoristic of Shmuel, right? Samuel. So things like that. That's just the off my head example. Ricks, Hoskinson, Smith, and Gee provide example after example after example. These are either attested or they are plausible. We can plausibly reconstruct them. They probably work, right? So that to me is very impressive. Again, doesn't prove this necessarily, but the fact that the names show ancient attestation is a positive for the Book of Mormon's historicity. Connected to the names, to the Onomasticon, is what is called paronomasia, or wordplay or puns in the Book of Mormon. The reason why they're related is because very often the wordplay that you encounter in the Book of Mormon revolves around the names in the Book of Mormon, and it shows a subtle familiarity with the Semitic and Egyptian languages these names seem to derive from. So Matthew Bowen, my friend here, has published Name is Key Word, collected essays on onomastic wordplay and the temple in Mormon scripture. He provides example after example. Jershon, Alma, Abish, Nephi. You go through it. When the names are brought up and mentioned, the significance or the meaning of the name is played on in the narrative to illustrate and highlight something significant with the narrative or with the character or with their name or something, right? So it's not just that Joseph Smith gets good ancient names, it's that he then takes the next step forward and kind of provides a pun or a wordplay on the name that works in these ancient languages. It works on the name. So that to me is exciting because this is my wheelhouse, Semitic and Egyptian languages. And so looking at how the text, at least on the English level, seems to accurately reflect this knowledge or familiarity with these Semitic languages and their names. That's always exciting to me. It's exciting for the historicity, but it's also interesting and cool, and it helps me sort of illustrate and highlight the significance of the text I'm reading. So there would be another example. The onomasticon and the paronomasia, they sort of go hand in hand together as they work in the Book of Mormon. And again, this isn't just a Book of Mormon thing, this is a biblical thing. It's widely recognized and acknowledged that there is wordplay and paronomasia in the biblical records. Scott Nogle just recently published a big book through SBL Press within the last year or two, giving a fairly comprehensive look at this. Wordplay appears in Mesopotamian sources, it appears in Egyptian sources, biblical sources. This is a thing that ancient writers like to do a lot. They like to riff on names of things or people or concepts, and they will integrate that into their narrative in fun, interesting ways, right? So I commend Matt Bowen's work. A lot of this stuff is online on the Interpreter Foundation too, so you can read his work there to get a sense of what I'm talking about. But the paronomasia and the onomasticon, they go hand in hand. Of course, I'm sure all your listeners know about Hebraisms. We won't beat the dead horse here. Suffice it to say, I'm convinced that the substantial quantity of Semitic and Egyptian literary features in the text, in my judgment, most likely means it's an artifact of the translation of an underlying original. Of course, you'll get arguments that, well, these appear in the King James Bible, so Joseph Smith is just imitating the King James Bible.
Or perhaps the late war.
Or the late war. You can make that argument if you want. However, I think the argument loses its explanatory power and it loses its ability to account for the Book of Mormon when you see the critical mass of this stuff happening in the book. And this is something that actually scholars use to try to determine if a text is a translation of an original. So, for example, there's this text called the Apocalypse of Abraham. The Apocalypse of Abraham, it only survives in medieval manuscripts, like in Old Church Slavonic and I think Coptic or whatever, right? Or Greek, like it only survives in medieval manuscripts. But scholars are pretty uniformly thinking it's actually a translation of an underlying Hebrew original. And one of the criteria they use for that is that the Hebraisms in the text of the Apocalypse of Abraham. And they say there are so many of them in this book that it's unlikely that the author was doing sort of, imitating biblical language, right? What people say what Joseph Smith may have done. So the more of a substantial quantity you get of these things, I feel the less likely you attribute it to the author imitating it as opposed to it being an original, a translation of an original, of an underlying ancient source. I think that's the case in the Book of Mormon. But again, on itself, this isn't definitive proof, but it goes along consistently with it being ancient. It's a convergence between the text and the ancient world. And I think the better explanation is to say it's a translation of an underlying ancient original. We touched on New World geography, right? We touched on John L. Sorenson and his work and Brant Gardner and others. So again, yes, we do not have, as of now, direct topographic artifactual evidence for Nephites in America. We don't have a welcome sign, welcome to Zarahemla, population 10,000 Nephites. We don't have that yet, right? I completely acknowledge that. And no matter what people say, Zarahemla is not in Iowa. I'm sorry, it's not, but that's another thing. But we do have an increasing number of, again, convergences with Mesoamerican culture. This is what Brant Gardner and John Sorenson and Carrie Hull and Mark Wright and John Clark and others have talked on. They're showing where the Book of Mormon's depiction of society, of Nephite and Lamanite society and culture, converges increasingly and recognizably with what we know about Mesoamerican culture, e.g. complex stratified hierarchical societies. That's something that really wasn't known in Joseph Smith's day. It is known today. It matches well. The geoclimate of Mesoamerica, so the volcanism described in 3rd Nephi converges very nicely with what we know about the geological history of Mesoamerica. Jerry Grover is a geologist that's written about this very persuasively, that the destruction in 3rd Nephi is describing volcanic activity that works well for a Mesoamerican setting, and technology. So the examples of like cement, Book of Mormon describes Nephites using cement. We know that the ancient Maya and Aztec had a form of cement, and highways. This is the big deal that you've heard probably about all the LiDAR discoveries coming out here, right? They do these LiDAR ground penetrating laser technology, and they find out that these Mesoamerican sort of like city centers or city complexes were connected to each other by an extensive route of like highways that stretch on for miles and miles and miles. And it's the jungle overgrowth has covered them. So we don't know, we haven't uncovered them, but we can see them through the LiDAR technology. That's described in the Book of Helaman. That's described in the Book of Mormon. This a system of cities that are linked together through this highway system, right? So, and it converges. It's late pre-classic Maya timing for this, right? So, anyways, I could go on. These are just some examples. So, no, we don't have Welcome to Zarahemla, but we do have all these other little interesting convergences that come together, in my judgment, to show a plausible ancient setting in Mesoamerica, a plausible ancient setting in the ancient Near East and ancient Arabia. And that works well to bolster confidence in historicity. That also works well to understand and read the text. We should, I believe, read it in this context as an ancient text in these settings primarily, right? That should be sort of our conceptual worldview, that we imagine this book happening because we see these convergences. So it works sort of in both those directions.
Am I right in thinking it'd be an unrealistic expectation that we would find, like a building or an altar that said Zarahemla on it? If it was written in a different language, like it'd be hard to determine if it is a Nephite or Lamanite sort of artifact or building.
Well, I'm not an expert in Mesoamerican archaeology. I can just rely on what my colleagues have told me or my friends have told me who are experts in this field. And what they tell me, at least, is that Mesoamerican archaeology, and especially epigraphy and things of that nature, are still very much, I won't say in their infancy, but they're not nearly as well developed as, say, Near Eastern biblical archaeology, right?
Right.
So one of the things that the LiDAR technology is showing us, and this has been known sort of intuitively by archaeologists working in the area, is that the sites are not nearly as well excavated as we thought they were. The attested inscriptional and epigraphic material isn't nearly as great as we thought it was. There are still just giant gaping holes in our knowledge, and so we should be cautious in making these final judgment calls. Oh, because we haven't found Zarahemla, therefore it means it's false. Well, there's problematic reasoning for that, that others have sort of talked on. So I kind of take their deference on what the state of the scholarship is now right now in Mesoamerica based on what they've told me. And so, yes, we should recalibrate our expectations for now based on just the state of our knowledge of ancient Mesoamerica as it pertains especially the Book of Mormon times. So we're talking the pre-classic and early classic Mesoamerica, chronologically speaking, right? So yeah, I think you're probably right there to intuit that we should be hesitant to expect this right now at this time.
Right. Okay. That's grand.
Yeah. So I think that should pretty much cover. Oh, I did want to say one thing that you mentioned. It's funny. I can kind of run through my mind an exercise, a hypothetical of what would happen if we were to discover an inscription with Zarahemla on it, let's say. And this is this hypothetical comes to mind because I've seen it happen with biblical data. So things pertaining to biblical archaeology, like the Tel Dan stela, for example, when that was discovered, or with Nahom for that matter. So let's imagine a scenario in which we uncover an inscription from Mesoamerica and it says, "Welcome to Zarahemla." Here's how I think it would probably unfold. So the first thing that people would say is, well, that doesn't really say "Welcome to Zarahemla." It says something else. And then we could show, no, it really does say, the inscription really does say "Welcome to Zarahemla." The next thing they'd say is, well, okay, but it's not the Zarahemla from the Book of Mormon. Well, no, actually it is, because it has to be because of these reasons. Well, okay, maybe it is the Zarahemla from the Book of Mormon, but Joseph Smith had a source somewhere that he could have gotten it from. And so you would go down this rabbit hole of these sort of excuses for this. This happened with the Tel Dan stela. So for those who don't know, this is an Aramaic inscription discovered in 1994, I think it was. And it contains a reference to the Beit Dawid, the house of David, right, referring to the Davidic dynasty. this is taken as proof because, or not proof, but evidence, because it is evidence for the historicity of the Davidic dynasty. And you saw this play out with biblical scholars who wanted to doubt or deny the historicity of the biblical dynasty. They said, well, the inscription doesn't say House of David. Well, okay, it does say House of David, but it's not the David from the Bible. Well, okay, it is the David from the Bible, but it doesn't prove the historicity because it doesn't say all the other stuff or whatever. So you would get this sort of rabbit hole of excuses. I'm sure that would probably happen. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think so, based on the examples of other.
At the end of one of my interviews with Dan Vogel on the witnesses, he would lean toward his view of the witnesses, the way he interprets them, because he doesn't believe the Book of Mormon is historical. I asked him a hypothetical, like if we were hypothetically to find, an altar that said Zarahemla, would that cause you to, shift your views or be open, change your views on the way you look at the witnesses and perhaps the Book of Mormon's historicity? And he said yes, which I thought was pretty cool. So if that were to happen, and if Dan, if you're listening, I'm going to hold you accountable to what you said, if that were to happen.
Well, I mean, that's good to hear, I guess, right? I commend Vogel for his integrity there, his intellectual consistency. Maybe I'm being cynical. I could just be, I'll own that. But I've seen this enough in other contexts that I'm always just a little thinking like, would that really change your opinion on this? But kudos to him, to Vogel, if that's the case, right? And to others who can be intellectually consistent like that. Yeah. So the takeaway for me, just to kind of wrap it up, so I don't keep filibustering here. Again, the cumulative effect, as I see it, when it comes to Book of Mormon historicity, is that it more and more looks plausibly like an ancient record translated from a Semitic or an Egyptian original, and that it is not a purely 19th century composition. It's not a modern composition. That's my sort of ultimate takeaway as I look at the evidence. I have two kind of modern categories I just kind of made up. Historicists, people such as myself, who believe that the Book of Mormon is a translation of an ancient text and it contains historicity. I believe historicists, we can account for both the modern elements in the text, e.g., for example, King James citations, as well as the ancient convergences. However, modernists, such as Dan Vogel and others who deny or doubt the historicity, they cannot account for ancient convergences in a purely modern text. So I feel more comfortable as a historicist because I can account for both elements, whereas I feel modernists cannot account for both elements, or at least they have not shown me persuasively that they're able to account for this. And therefore, in my judgment, the historicist model has better explanatory power than the modernist one because it can account for a more bigger preponderance of the data than the modernist paradigm can. I also see that modernists have to resort to fanciful theories. You get this, for example, maybe Joseph Smith secretly had these maps from Arabia. Maybe Oliver Cowdery or Hiram Smith brought them over from Dartmouth College, and that's how he got them. Or maybe he took a trip down to some other college. I mean, you get into these, it's pure fantasy realm to try to account for the ancient convergences that I just find as fanciful. Neal Rappleye and I in our article took a fun example. There was an anti-Mormon website that claimed that, there was a college in Harmony, Pennsylvania that had these maps. And well, Joseph Smith lived in Harmony, Pennsylvania when he was translating the Book of Mormon. Therefore, that's where he got these from. Well, they had the wrong Harmony. It wasn't the Harmony, Pennsylvania that's Harmony today. It was a different Harmony, Pennsylvania that's like 200 miles away. So you get to these sort of fanciful theories to explain for this that I don't find very persuasive. You also get Hiram Smith studied at Dartmouth, and Dartmouth's a pretty intellectually grounded place. So maybe he had, first of all, Hiram Smith did not study at Dartmouth. He studied at like a boys' boarding school connected with Dartmouth. That's not quite the same thing. But also it doesn't matter because Hiram Smith and the Smith family were not living in Lebanon, New Hampshire at the time of the translation of the Book of Mormon, where Dartmouth is located. They were living in Manchester, New York. And so even then, the connection doesn't work chronologically, and it doesn't work for other reasons. So right.
And one thing I've noticed as well is people can sometimes accuse, apologists or believers of, doing mental gymnastics to get around maybe certain issues. One thing I noticed whenever I, came back to the church again, and I had a friend who was like wanting to know what my reasons were, and except for some of the spiritual things I share with them, one sort of, I thought, compelling evidence to support was the, Nahom Bountiful and old world geography, and he was coming up with all these things. Well, he must have had a map, or maybe he traveled over there. Right. There's some sort of naturalistic explanation, and it was interesting to me that he was coming up with all these excuses without even looking into it, because he could not fathom the possibility that maybe it could be historically true. Like that just
Sure.
wasn't an option, even though there was no evidence to support the excuses that he was coming up with.
Right. And to be fair, believing Latter-day Saints and apologists, they sometimes have fanciful theories and mental gymnastics. That certainly is a case.
Yes.
And so like, I'm not saying this is exclusively a problem for people who deny historicity. Rather, my point is to say that cognitive dissonance and mental gymnastics is man's universal heritage. It's not exclusively a thing that just the apologists do, right? When human beings writ large encounter data or evidence that runs against their priors and runs against their commitments or their worldviews, there's cognitive dissonance, and they have to grapple with it in various ways. And everybody does it. It's common among everybody. I just happen to see those who deny the histories of the Book of Mormon tend not to be very honest about it. They tend to be very dismissive, and they act like they don't have any cognitive dissonance or any fanciful theories to get around these problems for their theory. And my point is just to say, on the balance, I find the arguments for historicity and the arguments of the historicist paradigm more compelling and less problematic than those who adhere to the modernist paradigm.
Gotcha. Okay.
But there we have it. So there's our wrap up of the evidence for the Book of Mormon. So
yeah, I think this is a good place.
It's a good place to take a little break.
Yeah, I'll take a little break. I think this has been a really good, part one. I think it's good, to share sort of the case and evidence for the Book of Mormon. A bit of offense as well, because sometimes apologetics can be a lot of defense. And then, in part two, we'll be diving into some of the, critical arguments against the Book of Mormon being an ancient text, talk about anachronisms and other issues that critics point to. So stick with us for part two, but thank you everyone for watching. Thank you, Stephen, for doing this with us. And if you've enjoyed this video, like, share, and subscribe to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph. I'll put some links in the description to check out some of the articles and websites that were cited, and we'll see you on part two. Take care, everyone.
Great. See you then.
Thanks everyone for watching this video. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up, like, share, comment, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can listen to my episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can also follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. If you care to donate, you can via my PayPal or Patreon. Thanks for joining Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.